It was supposed to be a weekend to unplug, a simple escape into the wilderness before the grind of another work week. Two close friends, 26-year-old Megan Rowe and 27-year-old Hannah Price, set out for the Smoky Mountains on the morning of Friday, May 17, 2013. Both were experienced campers, comfortable in the outdoors, and neither had ever given their families reason to worry. They promised they'd be back by Sunday evening. They never returned. For the first few days, their families told themselves the same reassuring things people always do in those early hours. Maybe they'd lost track of time. Maybe they'd decided to stay an extra night. But by Monday morning, when neither woman had called into work, concern hardened into something darker. By Monday night, search and rescue teams were in the mountains. In the years that followed, the only physical evidence of their trip that anyone ever found was there. Abandoned campsite, a place so strangely untouched, it seemed almost staged. Then, 8 years later, discovery beneath the floor of a park ranger's basement would expose a truth so disturbing that even seasoned investigators had trouble speaking about it aloud. Megan and Hannah had met 3 years earlier at a Knoxville climbing gym. Hannah was an elementary school art teacher. Megan worked as a nurse in the emergency department of a regional hospital. Their friendship grew quickly, forged over shared weekend hikes and long road trips in Hannah's beat-up Subaru Outback. They'd been to the Smokies together before, but this trip was different. Megan had just finished a brutal string of night shifts, and Hannah's school year was almost over. They wanted quiet, no crowds, no cell reception. They chose a backcountry site on the North Carolina side of the park, reachable only by a 6-mile hike from the nearest trailhead. Megan's older brother, Daniel, remembered helping them pack. They were organized, he would later tell investigators. Like, they knew exactly what they needed and what they didn't. It wasn't their first time out there. They even had a satellite beacon. Megan bought it after hearing a news story about a lost hiker. The beacon would become the first strange detail in the case. When search teams eventually located the women's campsite, the beacon was there, sitting on a flat rock just outside their tent. It was powered on, but no distress signal had ever been sent. The official timeline began with a photograph. It was taken by another hiker, a stranger. Late Friday afternoon on a ridge 2 miles from the site Megan and Hannah had reserved. The women were smiling, sweaty from the climb, with packs on their shoulders. They looked happy. There was nothing in the image, no expression, no figure in the background to suggest anything was wrong. By Saturday morning, no one outside the mountains saw them again. When rangers reached their campsite on Tuesday, delayed by a late spring storm that dumped almost a foot of wet snow on the higher elevations, what they found was unsettling in its stillness. The 2-person tent was zipped shut, sleeping bags neatly rolled inside. Their food was stored properly in a bear canister, untouched. Both backpacks leaned against a fallen log. Water filters, stoves, extra clothes, all of it was there. There were no tracks in the snow except those of the search party. No drag marks, no signs of an animal encounter, no blood. It was as if the women had simply stood up and walked into the trees, leaving everything that could keep them alive behind. Search efforts escalated fast. Helicopters swept over the ridges. Dog teams worked the drainages. Volunteers grid searched the surrounding miles for any trace, a scrap of clothing, a dropped water bottle, a boot print. They found nothing. The lack of physical evidence gnawed at everyone involved. Even in rugged terrain, even in bad weather, people left clues, torn fabric, snack wrapper, something. But after 2 weeks, the search was scaled back. That summer, rumors began to spread through nearby towns. Some said the women had staged their disappearance. Others whispered about illegal camps deep in the park where outsiders weren't welcome. One theory in particular took hold among locals that the women had crossed paths with someone they shouldn't have. Someone who knew the mountains well enough to make people vanish without a trace. For the families, the years that followed were an endless cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment. Unconfirmed sightings came in from other states. A farmer claimed to have seen them on a rural road in Virginia. A trucker swore he'd given to women matching their description a ride in Georgia. Each lead collapsed under investigation. By 2021, the case was cold. Evidence sat in boxes in a county storage facility. The only people still asking about it regularly were the families, and one retired ranger named Paul Keene, who had worked the original search and never quite let it go. That spring, a routine welfare check would lead deputies back to the mountains. Not into the backcountry, but to a modest home just outside the park boundary. Inside, under the floorboards of the basement, they found what the mountains had kept hidden for 8 long years. The call that brought deputies to 418 Timberline Road on the morning of April 12, 2021, seemed routine at first. The neighbor had asked for a welfare check on 63-year-old Park, Ranger William Bill Mercer, after not seeing him for several days. His truck was in the driveway. The house was dark. Mercer was well known in the area, a 30-year veteran of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, often the first to volunteer for backcountry searches. His reputation was of a man who knew every mile of trail and every unmarked hollow for miles around. When the deputies entered through the unlocked back door, they expected to find an older man who had perhaps suffered a fall. What they found, instead, was a house frozen in time, dishes in the sink, coffee grounds in the filter, a jacket hung neatly by the door. No sign of Mercer. The basement door was locked from the outside. They broke it open and descended into a space that smelled faintly of damp earth and something harder to place, a sour metallic tang that hit the back of the throat. The basement was unfinished. With poured concrete walls and a low ceiling crisscrossed by pipes in the far corner, beneath a heavy wooden workbench, the deputies noticed an odd patch of flooring. It wasn't concrete like the rest, but wide planks of mismatched wood fitted tightly together. The boards were newer than the surrounding structure, and there were faint scratch marks near the edges. It took a crowbar and several minutes of work to pry them loose. Beneath was a shallow cavity, the soil packed tight, and in that soil, wrapped in layers of decayed tarp and duct tape, were human remains. At first glance, the bones appeared old, weathered, but not ancient. There were remnants of fabric clinging to them, nylon webbing tangled in the joints, and the corroded frame of a backpack crushed against one side. The deputies stepped back, their radio suddenly loud in the still air. They secured the house immediately and called in the county sheriff, who in turn notified the State Bureau of Investigation. By that afternoon, the property was swarming with personnel, crime scene techs in Tyvek suits, evidence photographers, and a coroner's van parked out front. The dig took hours. The remains were fragile and the soil was dense with roots. Investigators worked with small trowels and brushes, revealing bone inch by inch. The first set was complete enough to clearly show a human form. The second was scattered ribs here, vertebrae there, a skull resting in the crook of an arm bone. By nightfall, it was clear they had 2 bodies. What startled investigators most were the objects buried with them. Alongside the corroded backpack were a pair of boots still laced, the leather stiff but intact, a faded red fleece with the zipper half pulled, and a bright orange stuffed sack containing a camping stove, utensils, and a dented metal mug. The stove's fuel canisters still had pressure. The following morning, the state crime lab began its work. The preliminary anthropological assessment indicated both victims were female, likely in their mid to late 20s. Dental comparisons would take days. But the similarities to the 2013 disappearance of Megan Rowe and Hannah Price were impossible to ignore for Sheriff Dana Melton, who had been a patrol sergeant during the original search. The implications were dizzying. "I remember those girls' families standing in the ranger station," she said later, "asking us if there was any chance they were still alive. And now I'm standing in this basement looking at the answer. Mercer was still missing. His truck was there, his wallet and keys on the kitchen counter, but no sign of him in the house or surrounding woods. It was as if he'd stepped out for an errand and never come back." That absence presented investigators with a chilling problem. Were they looking for a man on the run, or had Mercer himself met with foul play? While search teams canvassed the forest around Timberline Road, detectives began pulling every scrap of paper and pixel they could find on Mercer's life. What they uncovered in those first 48 hours would begin to stitch together a portrait that was far from the genial, trailwise ranger the community thought they knew. There were gaps in his employment records, stretches of months, marked as administrative reassignment without explanation. There were internal complaints buried in personnel files from seasonal staff who described Mercer as overly familiar with solo female hikers, and then there was the note. It was found in a small locked drawer in Mercer's desk, folded into quarters and sealed in a plastic sandwich bag. The paper was lined, torn from a spiral notebook. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. It read, "I didn't mean for it to go that way. I just needed them to stay. No names." Just that single, devastating line. Investigators were now certain of two things. The bodies in the basement had been placed there deliberately, and Mercer knew why. The formal identification came on the third day. Dental records confirmed what the families had already feared. The remains belonged to Megan Rowe and Hannah Price. Sheriff Melton called both families before the news broke publicly. The conversations were quiet, filled with long pauses. One of Megan's brothers asked the question Melton had been dreading. Were they? Were they there the whole time? Melton couldn't answer. Once the press release went out, the story exploded. Local headlines, regional networks, then national. 2 campers missing 8 years found in ranger's basement. It was the kind of headline that didn't feel real. As reporters swarmed the small town, investigators began reconstructing the original 2013 timeline in painstaking detail. They went back to every statement, every piece of physical evidence. From the first search, in those early days, Mercer had been everywhere. Records showed he was the first ranger to log a missing persons report. When Megan's and Hannah's families called in, he coordinated the search grid, personally led one of the teams that hiked into the backcountry to their campsite. His radio traffic was calm, clipped, almost rehearsed. Deputy Search Coordinator Alan Reed remembered something odd about Mercer's demeanor. He was, almost too certain. Like he already knew they weren't in the areas we were checking, Reed said. I chalked it up to experience at the time. These rangers, they have a gut feel. But now, looking back, it's different. On May 21st, 2013, 4 days after the women were last seen, Mercer filed a site report about the campsite. The description was nearly identical to what's in the official evidence log today. Tent zipped, gear untouched, food stored properly. What wasn't in the original report was the note that search dogs shown brief interest about 100 yards. Downhill from the campsite, Reed recalled that Mercer dismissed it quickly, saying it was probably a deer bed. The area was never grid-searched, 8 years later. That decision looked like the first in a series of careful diversions. While investigators traced Mercer's professional movements, another team worked to establish his personal connections to the victims. That's when they found the climbing gym. Sign-in logs from Knoxville. The handwriting was the same. Mercer's name appeared on at least 4 days in the spring of 2013. The same evenings Megan and Hannah were there. Whether those encounters were casual or deliberate was unclear. But it placed him in their orbit before the trip. The investigation also uncovered a troubling pattern from the mid-2000s. Multiple backcountry hikers, all women traveling in pairs or alone, reported brief encounters with a ranger matching Mercer's description who seemed to appear in remote areas without explanation. Most of these incidents were logged as benign hiker contacts. None were followed up now, with the bodies recovered. Every one of those old reports became potential evidence. Meanwhile, the search for Mercer intensified. Roadblocks went up. On every highway leading out of the county, his face was plastered on digital billboards and gas station bulletin boards. Dive teams checked ponds and culverts, but the man knew these mountains better than anyone. He didn't want to be found. He could vanish for weeks, maybe longer. That uncertainty gnawed at the victims' families. Hannah's mother, Denise Price, told a reporter, I don't want him out there breathing the same air as the rest of us. He's had 8 years we didn't get. 8 years our girls didn't get. On the 7th day of the manhunt, a break came from an unlikely source, a retired mail carrier named Luke Bennett, who lived in a weathered cabin 3 ridges over from Timberline Road. Bennett told deputies he'd seen someone matching Mercer's description moving along an old logging road at dusk 3 nights earlier. The man was carrying a pack, walking slow but steady, and he didn't return the wave Bennett gave him. When investigators checked that road, they found fresh boot prints and snagged in the bark of a low-hanging branch a strip of fabric. That looked suspiciously like a piece of a Park Service uniform. It was the first solid trail Mercer had left behind. The strip of uniform fabric was enough to bring in the tactical search unit from the state police. These weren't the volunteers and standard SAR crews who combed the mountains for lost hikers. These were trackers, trained in fugitive recovery. In dense wilderness, they started at first light. Moving in silence along the old logging road where Bennett had seen the man, the ground was damp from overnight rain, and that worked in their favor. The boot prints were sharp, each tread line visible. They were standard-issue Park Service boots, size 11. Matching Mercer's last known footwear, about half a mile in, the tracks left the road and cut into thick rhododendron. That was Mercer's signature. Locals said he could slip through a wall of brush without breaking a single branch. The search team spread out, leapfrogging in tight formations, marking each print and broken twig with survey tape. Twice they found small signs that he'd paused: a crushed cigarette butt, patch of disturbed soil under a pine where someone had knelt. By mid-morning, trackers reached a ridge that dropped steeply toward a stream. Below they found a makeshift camp, nothing more than a lean-to of branches and a bed of dry leaves. But the embers in the small fire pit were still warm. He was close. Sheriff Melton coordinated with the Park Service to set up a containment grid, teams positioned at choke points along ridges and water crossings. They hoped to herd him toward the valley where vehicles and drones could cut him off. But Mercer didn't run straight. Over the next 24 hours, his path twisted through terrain so rugged that even seasoned trackers lost the thread more than once. It was as if he was playing a game he'd invented, testing how long he could keep them following just enough sign to stay on him. When the rain returned that night, the trail all but vanished. The only clue they found the next morning was wedged in a hollow log, a laminated park trail map, edges curled from years of use, with routes marked in neat red ink. Several of the lines weren't on official maps. They were Mercer's personal trails, known only to him and perhaps a handful of rangers who'd worked decades in the Bacok. This shifted the hunt into psychological territory. Mercer wasn't just hiding. He was reminding them how much he knew. Meanwhile, forensic teams were still processing the basement. The soil around the bodies contained traces of a rare chemical preservative, the kind used by taxidermists. Investigators believed Mercer had used it to slow decomposition, buying him years before the remains might be discovered. The grim detail deepened the family's grief. It wasn't enough that he took them, Denise Price said. Kept them. On the 5th day of the manhunt, a breakthrough came from an aerial drone fitted with thermal imaging. Just after dawn, it picked up a heat signature under a rock overhang near the headwaters of Deep Creek. The team moved fast, surrounding the area in a horseshoe formation. As they closed in, they saw a figure crouched under the overhang, pack at his side, head down. "Bill," one of the rangers called. "It's over." For a moment, the figure didn't move. Then he stood slow, deliberate, and stepped into the open. He was thinner than they remembered, his beard streaked with gray, eyes scanning the tree line as if measuring escape routes. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You don't know what you're asking me to come back to." He didn't resist when they cuffed him, but on the hike back down he said one thing that stopped the lead tracker cold. They weren't supposed to be there that night. The interrogation room was small, fluorescent lit, with one metal table and 2 chairs. Mercer sat shackled, his wrists resting on the tabletop, his gaze fixed somewhere just past the two-way mirror. Sheriff Melton entered with State Bureau investigator Carla Ruiz, a woman known for her ability to sit in silence until suspects filled it with something they shouldn't. They started with the basics, confirming his name, his service record, and the fact that the remains had been positively identified as Megan Rowe and Hannah Price. Mercer didn't flinch. You said something when we picked you up? Rowe said after the preliminaries. They weren't supposed to be there that night. What did you mean? Mercer's eyes shifted, the faintest sign he'd heard her. Wrong place, wrong time, he said finally. What happens in the mountains? Melton leaned forward. Bill, this wasn't the mountains. This was your basement. You kept them. Silence. Rowe slid a photo across the table, the corroded backpack, dirt still clinging to the straps. We found this with them. Same gear they carried in 2013. Untouched. Why? Mercer's jaw tightened. They left it. I brought it home. The investigators exchanged a glance. Brought it home, Melton repeated. Bill, people don't just leave their packs, their stoves, their boots, and walk away. You know that. You've spent your life finding folks who do the opposite, cling to that gear like it's oxygen. So why were theirs left behind? Voice dropped. They were tired, cold. I offered shelter. The word shelter hung in the room like a bad smell. Where? Ruiz asked. My cabin, he said, as if it were obvious. Not this house. The one on the ridge. The one I kept for storms. This was the first they'd heard of any secondary property. Melton kept her face neutral, but her pulse picked up. What happened at the cabin, Bill? Mercer's hands curled into loose fists. We talked. Made a fire. They ate. Then they wanted to leave. And you didn't let them, Ruiz said. He didn't answer. The pause stretched until Mercer's breathing grew audible. I couldn't, he said finally. Not after I'd found them. Not after. After I'd been alone so long. Words shifted the temperature in the room. This wasn't a crime of sudden violence. This was something else. Possession. Control. What about the basement? Melton asked. Why take them there? Mercer's eyes flicked toward the mirror. It's not like I planned it that way, he said. You think I wanted them to? To go bad? I did what I could to keep them. I kept them. Him on the chemical preservative, he looked almost insulted. To protect them. So they wouldn't just fade. It was clear they weren't going to get a full narrative. Not yet. Mercer's confessions came in fragments, loaded with implication, but light on verifiable detail. Still, he had confirmed enough to build a case. He'd encountered the women, taken them to a hidden cabin, and never allowed them to leave. The next step was to find that cabin. Mercer, perhaps realizing what was coming, smirked. You won't. Get there without me. It's not on your maps. The search teams didn't need his directions. They had the trail map found in the hollow log during the manhunt with Mercer's reed ink roots. One of those lines cut toward an unmarked ridge miles from any established trail, a place even experienced hikers avoided. 2 days later, tactical team moved in. What they found at that ridge would fill in some of the blanks, but also open questions darker than anything the families had yet imagined. The ridge was nothing but a jagged seam of rock and old-growth forest, the kind of terrain that forced even experienced trackers to slow to a crawl. The approach took nearly 3 hours from the nearest point where vehicles could be left behind. When the tactical team crested the ridge, the structure came into view, a low, weathered cabin, half swallowed by rhododendron. Its roof sagged under decades of moss, and the single chimney leaned just enough to make it look as though the whole thing might collapse with one hard push. But the door was locked from the outside. They broke it open and stepped into stale air, heavy with the scent of mold and something faintly metallic. Inside was a single room. The walls were lined with shelves holding canned goods, tools, and jars of cloudy liquid. Against one wall was a cot with 2 folded wool blankets. The wood stove in the corner still had unburned logs stacked neatly beside it, though dust had settled thickly on everything. On the table sat 2 enamel mugs side by side, and a deck of playing cards fanned into a half-played game of rummy. It was the back wall that drew the team's attention, not because of what was on it, but because of what wasn't. A section of the log wall had been covered with a large canvas tarp nailed at the corners. When they pulled it aside, they found the logs beneath had been scraped smooth, almost polished, as if someone had sat for hours against them. In the corner near the foot of the cot was a small plastic tub. Inside were personal items: a silver locket with a tiny photograph inside, a knit beanie, a paperback novel with the first few chapters water damaged. The locket matched a description given by Megan's mother in 2013. The novel had Hannah's name written on the inside cover in blue pen. It was clear now that Mercer hadn't stumbled across the women and made a split-second decision. This was a space prepared for keeping someone. In the stove's ash pan, crime scene techs found burned scraps of paper. Most were too charred to read, but one fragment held a legible line in careful handwriting. "We should try again tomorrow. Maybe if we go together, he won't." The sentence ended in blackened edges. The ground behind the cabin revealed more. There was a shallow pit lined with smooth stones, as if meant for cold storage. The soil inside tested positive for trace amounts of the same preservative found in the basement. It was a grim symmetry. The cabin as the place they'd been kept alive, the basement as the place they'd been kept after death. Sheriff Melton stood in the doorway that afternoon, staring at the half-played game of cards. "This wasn't about the mountains," she said quietly to Ruiz. "This was about having them here, about making them stay." With the physical evidence from the cabin, the state's case against Mercer shifted from circumstantial to overwhelming. But there was still no definitive account of the women's final hours. Mercer remained vague, alternating between claiming they left in the night and suggesting they got sick and couldn't be saved. The medical examiner's report complicated things further. Both sets of remains showed no obvious trauma, no fractures, no bullet wounds. The preserved soft tissue was too degraded for toxicology to be conclusive. The families, Philotis, faced with that ambiguity, were forced to live with two truths at once. They now knew who had taken Megan and Hannah. They still didn't know exactly how their lives had ended. Then, 3 weeks before the trial, prosecutors received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a faded Polaroid showing Megan and Hannah sitting at the cabin table, mugs in hand, unsmiling, on the back. In the same careful handwriting found in Mercer's note were 4 words: they wanted to stay. The Polaroid hit the prosecution like a stone through glass. It wasn't just evidence, it was a message, one clearly meant to twist the narrative. Mercer's defense attorney, sharp-featured man named Leonard Pike, seized on it immediately. "You see," he told reporters outside the courthouse, "there's more to this story. My client provided food, shelter, companionship. We're not talking about a kidnapping, we're talking about 2 women who made a choice to stay in, a safe place, rather than risk the elements." For the families, the insinuation was unbearable. Denise Price stood in front of the courthouse steps the next morning, her voice shaking. They did not choose this. They had lives, jobs, people who loved them. This man took that from them. And from us, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Inside the courtroom, the trial unfolded with the same measured pace as the investigation that preceded it. The prosecution built their case from the ground up: the original disappearance, the untouched campsite, Mercer's unexplained connection to the victims, the cabin, the basement, and finally, the chemical preservative. They leaned hard on the pattern of prior encounters Mercer had with solo and paired female hikers over the years. Several women testified that he'd appeared in remote areas without being called, sometimes offering unsolicited advice about safer places too. Camp. One recalled waking in the night to find him sitting by her fire. It's uninvited. But it was the Polaroid that dominated the proceedings. Pike insisted it showed a consensual arrangement, painting Mercer as a man providing refuge to 2 women in distress. He argued that the lack of trauma on the remains supported the idea they died of illness or environmental factors, tragedies, not murders. The prosecution countered by introducing expert testimony from a behavioral psychologist, who explained how isolation, dependency, and coercive control could strip victims of the ability to make free choices. She pointed to details in the photograph, the identical mugs. The body language, both women leaning slightly away from Mercer's side of the table.
Ass.
Their hands tight around the cups, and then came the card game. The prosecution brought the deck into evidence, highlighting that it was mid-hand when the women vanished from the cabin. People don't just walk away from a game they're in the middle of unless something interrupts them, the lead prosecutor told the jury. That interruption was William Mercer deciding they weren't going to leave, not that night. Not ever. The jury saw photographs of the cabin interior, the locket, the beanie, the burned note fragment. They saw the hand-drawn map with routes no one but Mercer knew. They heard his own words from the arrest. They weren't supposed to be there that night. When Mercer took the stand, against his attorney's advice, the courtroom went still. He spoke softly, his eyes darting to the gallery where the families sat. "I didn't hurt them," he said. "They came with me because they didn't want to be cold." "They could have left, could they?" the prosecutor asked. Mercer paused, then said, "Not without me." It was the closest thing to a confession anyone would ever get. After 5 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of unlawful disposal of human remains. When the judge read the sentence, life without parole, Mercer showed no reaction. But outside, in the glare of cameras and the crush of reporters, Denise Price said something that cut through the noise. "This isn't the end. We still don't know what happened in those last hours. And until we do, there's no real closure." In the weeks after the verdict, Smoky Mountains looked the same, ridges folding into each other under summer haze, streams cutting silver threads through deep hollows. But for the families of Megan Rowe and Hannah Price, the landscape had changed forever. The Park Service released a brief statement expressing sympathy for the victims' loved ones and promising an internal review. Behind the scenes, that review was far from brief. A panel of former law enforcement officers and wilderness experts combed through Mercer's personnel file, his radio logs, his GPS data from patrols. What emerged was a troubling pattern: unsupervised assignments in remote sectors, complaints from seasonal staff that were quietly buried, and a habit of volunteering for searches in cases involving women hiking alone or in pairs. Mercer had created a reputation as the man who could find anyone, one retired ranger on the panel told an investigative journalist. Turns out that was exactly the problem. He knew how to find them because he knew how to watch them first. For Denise Price and Daniel Rowe, the review brought only more frustration. None of the systemic failures could undo what had happened. The cabin on the ridge was dismantled and burned in a controlled fire, its ash scattered in the creek below. The basement of Mercer's house was sealed, pending its eventual demolition. In Knoxville, memorial service was held in the climbing gym, where Megan and Hannah had first met. Friends hung their chalk bags from the rafters and taped photographs of weekend hikes along the walls. One showed the 2 women grinning with the sun in their eyes, a summit stretching behind them, a reminder of who they were before their story was reduced to a headline. Still, the unanswered questions lingered. The cause of death was officially listed as undetermined. The Polaroid remained a grim puzzle. Somewhere in the mountains, there might be other cabins, their hidden spaces Mercer had built over the years. The sheriff's office quietly opened a secondary investigation into unsolved disappearances in the region dating back to decades. At least 3 cases bore surface similarities: women last seen near backcountry trailheads, no sign of struggle, searches that ended with nothing. Mercer, now in a maximum security facility, refused further interviews. Letters from journalists, investigators, even victims' advocates went unanswered. His only regular correspondence was with a former park colleague who visited once a month. What they discussed was never shared. For the community, the betrayal cut deep. "The mountains are supposed to be a refuge," said Alan Reed, the former search coordinator. "There's this shadow over them. You can't tell people to trust the rangers the same way anymore." Late that summer, a hiker bushwhacking near an unmarked ridge stumbled upon something odd: a small metal box wedged into the roots of an old oak. Inside were photographs, landscapes, trail junctions, and, in several, hikers snapped from a distance, unaware they were being watched. One of the faces was Megan Rowe. Another was Hannah Price. The box was turned over to the sheriff's office. The photographs were logged as evidence. The possibility of other victims became harder to ignore. The metal box changed everything. For months after Mercer's conviction, the investigation had been in a slow, uneasy wind-down. Paperwork, file reviews, the occasional follow-up on a cold lead, but now with a tangible cache of images hidden. Deep in the Smokies, the sheriff's office couldn't ignore the possibility that Megan and Hannah weren't Mercer's only victims. The photographs were methodical. Some were crisp daylight shots. Others were grainy, taken in dim light. Each was numbered in pencil on the back, as if part of a personal catalog. Many featured women, solo hikers, pairs, small groups moving along trails or sitting at campsites unaware of the camera. What made investigators' skin crawl was the consistency. Every photo was taken from concealment, through foliage, behind rocks, from shadowed bends in the trail. And in the bottom corner of some frames, barely visible, was the outline of Mercer's parquet hat brim. Out of 63 photographs, 9 were identified immediately. Local hikers who remembered brief encounters with Mercer, but had no idea they'd been photographed. 3 more matched unsolved disappearances from the past 15 years. The last 10 photographs were different. They showed no faces, only locations, secluded glades, narrow ridges, hollowed-out trees. Each was marked with a date in Mercer's handwriting. Cross-referencing those dates with Park Service patrol logs revealed something chilling on every one of them. Mercer had been off duty. Sheriff Melton authorized a new search operation, bringing in ground teams, drones, and cadaver dogs. Their first priority was the ridgeline where the metal box had been found. Day 1 yielded. It's nothing but rough terrain and weather that shifted, from fog to hard rain. On day 2, a team moving along a game trail in one of the photographed glades found a small depression covered in leaves. Beneath was a rusted metal trunk sealed with a padlock. Inside, clothing, a sleeping bag, and several journals wrapped in oilcloth. The earliest entry was dated 2004. The handwriting was Mercer's. The journals read like a field diary, but not of wildlife or weather. They documented people first names, physical descriptions where they were camped, how far they were from the nearest trailhead, whether they were approachable. Some entries were benign. Others dripped with possession. I dated 2 years before Megan and Hannah vanished. Read, 2 young women on Hazel Creek. Stayed 3 nights. Watched them every evening from the ridge. Never came close. Could have echoed through every page. By day 5. The search teams had covered nearly every location in the final 10 photographs. In one, they found the remains of a crude shelter, half collapsed. In another, buried beneath a rotting log, they recovered a canvas duffel containing 3 more Polaroids, 2 of unidentified women. One of a man whose face was obscured by shadow. Forensic analysts began the slow work of dating the images, examining the film type, cross-referencing them with missing persons reports. But for the families of Megan and Hannah, the discoveries only deepened the wound. Denise Price refused to look at the newly recovered photographs. Daniel Rowe, however, insisted on seeing every one. "We have to know if there's more," he told Melton. "If there's even one more family out there waiting for someone to come home, they deserve to know." The investigation's focus had shifted, no longer just about justice for 2 women, but about uncovering the full scope of what Mercer might have done in the mountains he knew better than anyone. And as the autumn rains set in, the search widened beyond the Smokies into neighboring forests and parks where Mercer had worked temporary assignments over his career. If the photographs were a map, they suggested something terrifying. The Smoky Mountains were not the only place Mercer had made people disappear. By early winter, the expanded search had spread across 3 states, following the threads Mercer's journals hinted at. The work was slow, methodical, the kind of search that required patience and an unsettling willingness to find what you didn't want to find. The break came in mid-December on a wooded slope just inside the Nantahala National Forest. The location matched one of the earliest entries in Mercer's journals. Dated 1999. long before Megan and Hannah's disappearance, beneath a cairn of moss-covered stones. Searchers uncovered human remains, partial, weathered, but with enough preserved to allow forensic analysis. Nearby was the rusted frame of a backpack and a set of enamel cookware, so old it looked like it belonged in a museum. A nameplate from a trail permit was still legible, pressed between 2 pages of a decomposed guidebook. It read, K. Duval. When investigators ran the name, they found a long-forgotten missing persons case, 23-year-old Catherine Duval, last seen leaving her car at a Blue Ridge trailhead in the fall of '99. At the time, her disappearance was chalked up to an accident, bad weather, a wrong turn, a fatal fall. The discovery confirmed otherwise. Forensic testing later revealed the same chemical preservative and traces around the bones, linking her death directly to Mercer. It was his earliest known victim, but investigators suspected not his first. The find sent ripples through the mountain communities. Old rumors resurfaced, hikers revisited uneasy encounters they'd had over the years, and families of other missing persons began calling the sheriff's office, asking if Mercer's journals mentioned their loved ones. For Denise Price and Daniel Rowe, the confirmation that Mercer's predations stretched back decades was both sickening and clarifying. It means he didn't just find Megan and Hannah by chance, Daniel said. He'd been doing this for years. He was hunting. In the spring, the sheriff's office held a closed-door briefing for the families connected to Mercer's confirmed and suspected victims. They laid out the known timeline, the evidence, and the areas still being searched. It wasn't closure, but it was the closest thing to truth they'd had. Mercer, now 2 years into his life sentence, remained silent. He neither confirmed nor denied the new discoveries. Though when informed of Catherine Duval's identification, he reportedly smiled faintly and said, "She was the first one who trusted me." The cabin was gone. His house, with its basement sealed off, was scheduled for demolition, but the mountains remained vast, unblinking, holding their secrets in the folds of ridges and the depths of their hollows. At the dedication of a memorial plaque near the trailhead where Megan and Hannah began their final hike, Denise Price spoke softly to the small crowd gathered there. These mountains took them, yes, but they also held the people who went looking for them, who refused to stop. We'll keep looking for the rest of them, for the truth, until there's nothing left hidden. As hikers moved past the plaque that day, bound for the high trails, the air felt heavier, the shadows a little deeper. Woods. There might still be traces of others Mercer had crossed paths with, and as Sheriff Melton later put it, "We may never find them all, but we're going to try." Because in the Smoky Mountains, the difference between being lost and being taken had always been more fragile than anyone wanted to believe.